Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to continue on as we were. Um, I I was looking at the schedule right before class, and there's a little bit of wiggle room for after this week before the midterm. We have 2 weeks. We have 3 weeks from today before the midterm. So we have this week, then the next week, which I know I have content for that applies directly to the midterm. And then there's like one more kind of buffer week that that the midterm was originally scheduled for, but then because of the hurricane, just kind of how things worked out, the content that I would be going over that week is actually content that doesn't relate to the midterm. It's the second half of the semester. Um, we have enough time to still cover all of that content simply because we're not going to be having release time field experiences because of COVID and not having to go to the classroom for field experiences. So I'm not 100% sure what the next week and the following are going to look like. Um, One of the things that I was thinking is that next week, especially considering social distancing and not having everyone in class together, giving us an opportunity to, at least on one of the days, probably the Tuesday, not meet in class and have some virtual breakout session time to actually prepare for that mock IEP meeting that I was talking about. And then Thursday, do presentations of those somehow. We'll figure it out. And then the following week, to make up for the Tuesday, we would be in class, and Thursday, we would all be virtual. I have a guest speaker I have to confirm, but she's going to be virtual. So if she's going to be virtual, then we can all be virtual. So that's kind of what I'm thinking for the next 2 weeks. So taking the content of this week, the IEP meeting, which is really foundational to the process of special education, and stretching it from this week, where we go over most of the content, into next week, where we do the mock meeting, and then go into high and low incidence disabilities the week after, which would bring us right up to the midterm. So as of right now, that's what I'm thinking, what I think is probably going to happen. What I, I'm fairly confident of that. I will give you that concrete schedule on Thursday. So for those who like to plan and like to put days and times and notes and things in your calendars, the plan right now is this Tuesday is today, we're here. Thursday, continue. Next Tuesday, no in person, everyone online. Thursday would be IEP meetings sharing, and we'll kind of figure that out. The following Tuesday would be in person. The following Thursday would be everyone online, and then the midterm the week after that with no class. Okay, so it's a little jumbled. It makes sense in my head right now. I have to make sure it actually works on paper and I get everything lined up, but that's kind of the plan that I'm anticipating at the moment. Okay, any questions about that? Sound good online? Yep. All right, awesome. I figured it'd be nice to give everyone a little bit of a break from coming in and try and make it as equitable as possible between the Tuesday and the Thursday group. All right. Before I start and jump into the IEP meetings, are there any questions that are thoughts that came up regarding the RTI meeting, the RTI team, the RTI process? That process is very much a less used process than the IEP process, but we constantly see the need for it when we end up with children who are having difficulties, who are third and fourth graders, who maybe came from a different parish or a different state or even a different school. We see that quite often where a child shows up, they don't have an IEP for whatever reason, but they're clearly struggling. And as a district, you have to make a decision or do something now to support that child. So that's a very common place where we see the RTI process come into play, is when a child is moving into a parish that has a well-established special education program, and maybe coming from a school or a district or a parish that does not. All right. So any questions about that process? Here, all good? Online, y'all good? Okay, cool. All right, so then moving into the IEP document, the IEP process, what it looks like, what it entails. This is going to be the next, like I said, couple of weeks for us. Understanding if you're going to be a special education teacher, if you're interested in being a special education teacher, understanding the IEP process is central to understanding special education as a whole. When you understand this document, you will see that everything in your classroom flows out of the IEP. Your classroom is effectively structured to ensure that you have met all of the requirements as set forth in all the IEPs for all the children in your classroom. All right. For general education teachers, your classrooms are structured based on the needs of the district. You choose the curriculum that the district tells you. You have probably a selected reading list. You might have to have some number of computers or centers or whatever the district or school or your principal has decided is necessary for you to teach the majority of your students. It doesn't exist in special education. There are more and more instances where districts are requiring specific special education curriculum. There's one in particular called Unique Learning that many districts are starting to adopt as their primary special education curriculum. But for the most part, you as the teacher, the special education teacher, has the ability to modify that within the IEP. All right. So if you have 5 children, let's say you have 8 children in your class, and 5 of them require the exclusive use of a computer. You will have 5 computers in that class with 8 children, whereas a class of 25 kids may have 2 or 3 computers. You may have one child who is on one specific reading curriculum and another child who is on a different reading curriculum. And you will have both of those reading curricula in your classroom. You'll have adapted chairs and writing utensils and specific toys potentially. There's so much that can flow out of the IEP into your classroom. And if you show up in your brand new classroom, you've never taught before, you have all these weird things in your classroom, you don't know what they're for, that chances are that's because you haven't looked through your children's IEP just yet, all right? As a special education teacher, being familiar with your children's IEP is going to define or going to be one of the defining features of your success or failure as a special education teacher. If you are not working towards the IEP goals, you are putting your license at jeopardy. You're putting the school at jeopardy. But by the same token, once you kind of get into the swing of things, you will realize that as the teacher, you have pretty heavy-handed control over what goes into the IEP document. If you had let's say you show up as a first-year special education teacher and you're handed these 8 IEPs, right? You don't have any say in them. And you go through them and you teach it, you do the best that you can, and you're like, I really don't like this reading curriculum. I've done a little bit of research and I found this other reading curriculum that I think I would like to use better. I think it's more suitable for the child's needs. It meets their goals. I want to switch to that. You get that written into the IEP, the district's going to get that, or should get that curriculum for you, and you're off and running. All right. So you have that sort of control and power so long as the district agrees with you, so that you, as the voice of the district in the IEP meeting, can speak to the parent, and that the parent agrees with you as well. All right. So you still can't unilaterally make that decision. But if you get everyone on board, then those pieces will come. We work with Dr. Grant Gautreaux and I work with St. James Parish really, really closely, have for almost a decade now, if not more. And we've worked with that parish to accumulate a number of different curricula and materials that we feel very strongly about as being beneficial towards the needs of those students. As if a child comes in that requires a curriculum that we don't yet have, the district has been very amenable to looking into purchasing that. When the district wants to make changes, they run those changes through us to make sure that we agree that those changes are going to be beneficial to their students. So when you're in that situation, you just have so much more freedom and control over what goes on in your classroom. All right. Today and Thursday and next week is going to be about the process to get to that point. How do we get from a blank document to 8 documents that effectively build this classroom? All right. So as I have hopefully made abundantly clear, the IEP is the primary document that governs the educational needs of children with disabilities. All right. It's a legal contract between the school and the family and the providers as to who is going to do what, who is going to provide what in order to meet the needs of that child. I think it's very important that when we talk about the educational needs and the role of the family, all right? We'll come back to this later on, but I want you to think about what seems like maybe some of the worst case scenarios when you have families that are not participating necessarily in their children's education, when you have families that don't show up to IEP meetings, and what that's going to mean. So keep that in the back of your mind. All right. IEPs are updated annually. You have to have at least one IEP meeting every single year, period, end of story. You cannot skip a year. All right. Progress is reported on multiple times per year, usually similar to a report card time. So every 9 weeks, you would expect to be updating the family in written or vocal format as to the progress of the child. All right. It's much, much more detailed than, as we're going to see, than a report card in and of itself, but it's not as detailed as the IEP meeting. There we go. All right. So within the IEP or the scope of IDEA, of those funds, there are 2 documents. There is an IEP, which is from age 3 to age 21. Remember, it started from 5 to 18. It was expanded up to 21 and then expanded down to 3. And there is an IFSP, or Individualized Family Service Plan. That's for those children who are born with a disability that is known to have an impact educationally in nature. All right. So right away, if that child is identified, they can be given an IFSP, which is a school document that is given prior to school age. right? School document prior to school age. This might help the family receive services in the home. This might allow the family to receive services at a daycare, again, provided by the school, all right, or the school district. I mentioned that I worked at a special education kindergarten, where many of the, or preschool, preschool really, it had an early intervention wing. So those children could be as young, by the time I left, as young as a year, as old as 3, in that early services or early intervention service. Those students were being seen and funded through an IFSP. When after 3, they had their first IEP meeting, they were given their official IEP diagnosis, then they moved to the preschool, and they were in the preschool from 3 to 5, right? 3 years old to 5 years old, all right? At age 16, so within the IEP, the latter half of the IEP years, transition and vocational skills and goals are added to the IEP. So we want to make sure that as we near the end of the IEP years, we are not leaving out the what comes next. And it's important that that starts as early as 16, even if the child is going to be with the school system until age 21, because especially if they are going to be granted access to those funds and mechanisms and classes through age 21, that usually means the child is going to need an expanded period of time to reach those goals. So we want to make sure that we're starting working on those goals earlier rather than later. When we work with our more severe, I won't say our most, but our more severe children in a clinical setting, working with special educational needs, we oftentimes start thinking about transitions and what's going to happen after 18 or what's going to happen after 21 around the age of 13. Because we just know it might take that long to learn how to complete all those daily living skills, vocational skills, whatever it may be. All right, so just as we had an RTI team, so too do we have an IEP team. The difference between the two is that in an RTI team, remember I spoke about the cross-section of the school, all the different people that have familiarity with some section of the school. You have special teachers, you have gen ed teachers, you have special education teachers, you have administrators, you have ELL teachers, you have all different types of teachers there. In an IEP team, it's a little bit different. You can have any number of those participants as well, but in an IEP team, you have every teacher or every licensed professional who works in some capacity with the student. So on an RTI team, you probably have multiple people that have never worked with the student before. On an IEP team, you have everyone that does work with the student, all right? The one exception being if the child has multiple general education teachers, you only need one representative from them. And if you have child-specific paraprofessional support or pairs in the classroom, they wouldn't necessarily be on the IEP team, although they may inform the teacher as to some of some data or some information that could be provided there. So who are some of the possible participants on the IEP team? You can have learning consultants, who can be outside personnel who potentially work with the child. You could have school psychologists and counselors. You have gen ed teachers. You definitely have special education teachers, principals or administrators, a case manager. There should be someone who is extremely well versed in not just special education practices, but special education law and the process of the IEP to make sure that you are doing everything that you are supposed to do. And that's the case manager. Relevant specialists, physical therapists, speech therapists, occupational therapists, behavior analysts that might maybe work at the school or within the system. The parents are part of the IEP team, and to the degree that you can, the student should be part of the IEP team as well. When you have higher functioning students in special education, especially as they get older, you want that student as much as possible to participate in the IEP meetings themselves. Not just that they, to the degree possible, they should help develop goals. To the degree possible, they should report on their own progress. And the degree possible, they should participate in the meetings. All right. Okay, I'm not going to read through these in general. These are subjective. This is not part of IDEA. This is not part of the law. But these are ideas that come from the collaborative process of special education, where if you follow them, you should have a relatively successful IEP meeting. What's one of the major differentiating features between an RTI team and an IEP team is the longevity that the team works with an individual student. On an RTI team, it's okay if you don't necessarily agree with what all the teachers are deciding on. It's okay if you don't necessarily agree on what the teacher ultimately decides to do. You're there to advise, inform, brainstorm, but then when you're done with the RTI meeting, until the next time the child comes up, month, 2 months, 6 months next year, you're not really going to see them again. So you don't have to collaborate. You don't have to worry about collaboration with that team for that child as the months go on. On an IEP team, that's completely the opposite. You are working with these individuals day in and day out. If you, as a special education teacher, don't agree with what the speech therapist is doing, you have a problem. Because 2 to 4 times a week, the speech therapist is going to take the child out of the special education classroom or the inclusion classroom and work with them for an hour. So you want to make sure that you understand, agree, and can support what that speech therapist is doing. So collaboration is so much more infused into the IEP process than it is on the RTI process, all right? So the ideas here are ideas or principles to keep in mind when you are thinking about what it means to have effective collaboration for an IEP team. In EDUC 396, we will go over these or ideas like these much more, but I want them available for you guys to be thinking about now. All right, so now let's get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts, the procedural process into having an IEP meeting, all right? So before we jump into the IEP, we have to wrap up the RTI side of things. We have to, so if we're coming in from that branch, we have to make sure that the data has, or that the interventions have had time to work, that the data have borne out that the child really does need special education services. We can't just rely on any one test or measure or person to determine that a child is ready for special education or should be in special education. We have to have a number of these different materials. If that is the case, and we do feel comfortable with that is the direction that we are going to go, then we begin the IEP process. And from here going forward, this process looks the same no matter when it starts. So it can start at age 3, age 5, age 10, doesn't matter. We have now gotten to the point where we are going to begin an IEP. So why do we have an IEP meeting? All right, what are the reasons? I didn't, well, I guess it's here. So within 30 days of determining eligibility, first time eligibility for special education services, all right? So whether that is through the RTI process, whether it's through the child find process, whether it's through a medical diagnosis that leads to an IEP, within 30 days of determining that eligibility, you must have an IEP meeting. Why, for either group, why is it necessary to have that meeting so soon after a determination of eligibility? It seems like that's moving very, very quickly. You know, let's say you have a second grader, first grader who is diagnosed with a learning disability. They, through the RTI process, they've been getting their education for a year and a half, 2.5 years in the inclusion setting. It's determined they're eligible. Why all of a sudden do we move at lightning speed to have this meeting and get them into special education? Why now? Why might that be?
Because the students aren't receiving the services needed for an appropriate education.
Excellent. Very, very nice, Holly. Did you guys all hear that? The students are not receiving effectively a free and appropriate education. It's free, it's not appropriate. All of a sudden, we now have evidence that the setting they were in is no longer the appropriate setting, and FAPE is now from, as soon as that eligibility determination is made, FAPE is no longer being met, and we have to get that back on track. That is so, so, so important. So we do move very, very quickly from that initial identification of eligibility, all right? Some other possible reasons for having an IEP meeting on or before the annual review date, right? We said that we have the IEP meeting every year. So before that renew date or review date, we need to make sure it's there. Changes being made in the IEP. That can be a change in setting. It can be a change in minutes. That can be a change in services. It can be a change in goals. Any change to the IEP has to be made through a full IEP meeting. There are certain little carve-outs that don't change the fundamental nature of the IEP that you can do through email communication, through phone communication that's followed up on, that don't require an IEP. But if anything is going to be an ongoing process, procedural change, you're going to have an IEP meeting. Reasonable request of a team member. Any of those team members, parent, teacher, special ed teacher, specialists, any of those members can request an IEP meeting, all right? If something is really not working, if a new behavior shows up that you've not seen before, and you feel that you need the whole team to address it, you can call an IEP meeting. And then review and alteration of matters related to suspension or expulsion. So when there are special rules within the school system regarding what you can and cannot do in terms of suspension and expulsion for special education students. Basically, you can't suspend or expel a student as a result of their disability. All right, what does that mean? Let's say part of the disability is high-level aggression. Okay, if a child is having a significant tantrum and in that process they lash out or not lash out, but they hurt someone, they cannot be expelled for that. Most of the time, that is separated from deliberate attempts to hurt someone, right? If I have a child with a disability who is walking down a hallway and punches a teacher or a student, that's different than I'm having a tantrum and you got in my way and I turned and I accidentally clocked you, all right? So the schools have little carve outs for what can and can't be done. There are special ed lawyers out there who will say you cannot expel or suspend a special education student, period. And they make their livings fighting for it. I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that is one viewpoint, all right? And then the other viewpoint is you have administrators saying, my job is to keep everyone safe, right? So if your child are getting aggressive, I need the ability to protect my school environment. And then in that situation, it moves to the courts and we decide what's going to actually happen. All right. So how does the IEP meeting actually get set up? There's an actual process that is described in the law as to what needs to be done in order to get this meeting called and set up and run. Most of the time, this is done by an administrator, case manager, someone whose job, like I said, it is to know special education process and law. There must be evidence of advance written notice of invitation to all participants, parents, students, teachers. The date has to be cleared by everyone. The student can decline to come. If the student is not yet at a point where it's appropriate for them to participate, then you do not need to invite them. But the parent, the teachers, the administrators, everyone must receive that invitation within 2 weeks or prior to 2 weeks of the meeting happening. All of this, it's expected attending educators need to be invited. Contact information for the lead coordinator needs to be put on there. So if there are any issues, if anything does need to change, people know who to contact. When you, prior to the start of the meeting itself, it can be with that initial communication or up until right at the meeting, the parent has to be informed of their rights. There are oftentimes little pamphlets that the coordinators will give out. Make sure you've looked over this, that you agree with this, make sure that you understand what it's saying before you have the meeting. The parent needs to know what they can do, in particular, if they disagree before the meeting starts, all right? If you need an interpreter, make sure that you have an interpreter lined up, and that date of notice actually has to be documented on the IEP, okay? What happens if the parent can't be physically present? We can call in, we can video conference in, but even sometimes that's not possible, all right? It is possible to hold an IEP meeting without the parent present. However, you have to, one, document multiple attempts to have contacted that parent. Two, you have to inform the parent after the meeting of all the decisions that have been made, and they still have to sign it, all right? I'd love to say that the conversation usually stops there, but there is absolutely a subset of parents that, for whatever reason, don't sign the IEP. It's one thing if you don't sign it because you don't agree with it. It's another thing if you don't sign it because you are effectively not participating in the child's education. That second one poses a major problem. As soon as you, the school district, have passed that annual review date, you don't have the signed IEP, you are out of compliance, okay? The The legal remedy for this, I'm actually not entirely sure how this plays out in practice, but the legal remedy for this is the parent is effectively not taking part in their child's education. It's just like, I mean, I use this word very hesitantly because it has a specific meaning, but it's bordering on educational neglect, right? And that is a very much a punishable offense. So if you find yourself in a situation where you have reached out to the parent, you've documented that you've attempted to communicate with the parent multiple times, you're ready to hold the IEP meeting, make sure that the school administrators and possibly even legal team is aware that you've done your job as a teacher. You've done your job as a school. It's important to know if that's a pattern of behavior. Do they respond to regular classroom communication? Do they show up at field trips? Do they do this? Do they do that? Or are they completely absent? The IEP and not being present for it should be a last step, not a first step. All right? Okay, so once you have done everything you need to do to set up the IEP, now you actually get to the IEP meeting itself. The IEP meeting itself, just like the steps leading up to it, is a very regimented procedure. Again, unlike the RTI team, which is more like a brainstorm and is kind of like live collaboration, the IEP meeting is very structured. Everything's been hashed out ahead of time. You're not deciding on a ton of new information at the IEP meeting. You're more just communicating what has already been decided. If you need to have a back and forth with the parent because they agree with something, they don't agree with something, they want something else added, that can absolutely happen. But you're not deciding on the goals at the meeting. That's already been written. The primary documents have already been prepared. Oftentimes, they've already been shared with parents. All right? So first thing that needs to happen is you have to determine if the student still is eligible for special education services. All right? Every 3 years, you have to renew a child's eligibility. So just because a child gets placed into special education in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, does not mean that they are just going to be eligible to receive special education services through high school. They have to be retested again at third grade, third, fourth, fifth, before sixth grade, sixth, seventh, eighth, before ninth grade, and so on. If at any point, whether it's through educational testing, behavioral testing, psychological testing, they no longer qualify for special education services, then once you get through this and you're determined not eligible, the meeting's over. All right? Most disabilities are not curable, right? Most of these disabilities are not necessarily curable. Certain disabilities, like a learning disability, can be remediated to a point where services are no longer necessary. If there are no behavioral concerns, if you have caught the child up academically, if you have moved them into an inclusion classroom, and they are now learning from general education teachers with minimal support at a rate commensurate with their peers, then there is no longer a need for special education services. But unless all of that has been met, chances are you are going to remain eligible for an IEP, all right? When I spoke at the, I guess at the beginning of last week about the difference between the medical and educational diagnosis, right? Let's take something like autism, where there is no cure for autism, right? You can't lose a medical diagnosis of autism once it is diagnosed. That does not mean that you might no longer need special education services despite the diagnosis of autism. All right. It's possible that you could lose the educational services while maintaining the medical services. So the little things like that to keep in mind. And that's, that's for a small subset of students. Technically, the eligibility meeting and the IEP meeting are two totally separate meetings. You sign in to the eligibility meeting, you agree with everything, you've gone through it, all right, you're still eligible, you sign that you agree, that meeting ends, and then you can immediately shift into the IEP meeting itself. Everyone signs in, and you start the process over, all right? The parts of the IEP meeting go specifically in this order, all right? We start with the present levels of educational performance, or present levels of performance, which is abbreviated as PLEP or PLOP, depending on how silly your school districts are. We're going to go over that in a sec, but that's a detailed explanation of where the child is up to that date. After you've read through the PLEP, you address the annual goals. What has been met and what are the goals for the coming year. You then go into a statement of services. These statement of services or statements of service are basically PLEPs for the non-academically educational services that have been provided. So speech therapists, OT, PT, they're all going to be providing these statements of services, all right? That's just like the PLEP. You review what type of assessments the school is going to, or the child's going to participate in. You look at accommodations, you look at progress monitoring, all right? And then if there are any other kind of loose ends that need to be dealt with, like transportation, review of behavior plans, that kind of stuff, it's done at the end. The present levels of educational performance, the annual goals, and the accommodations are the three major parts of the IEP meeting. Identifying what assessments you're going to participate in, not necessarily how you're going to accommodate for them, but what they're going to participate in is kind of second to those. We need to identify if the child is going to participate in general education testing, basically. And there are a lot of, there's a lot of nuance around that. All right, so let's start by looking at the PLEP, the present levels of educational performance. Second, whoops. Here we go. All right, so the PLEP is a multi-page, detailed document, the purpose of which is to give the parents a very in-depth description of how the child has performed over the past year across academic, social, and behavioral domains. The level of detail that goes into the PLEP is going to really depend on the level of support that's needed for the child. The more support they need, the more detail needs to go into the PLEP. You want to make sure that the PLEP covers goals that are skills that have been mastered over the past year, current demonstration of the ongoing skills, and any skills that might require intervention going forward. Again, this is a review of what's happened, what's happening now, and what will happen in the future. At the meeting itself, you will read the PLEP all the way through. It needs to be spoken aloud at the meeting. The parent has it. They will most likely be able to read it. You still have to read the old information. Beyond the PLEP, or sorry. Yeah. Within the plot, you really want to make sure that you target any specific assessments that have been given. Those are your most concrete data regarding how the child has done. Even if those aren't structured assessments, if they're you know, teacher-made assessments specific to the goals at hand, you want to make sure that you cover those. Again, those targeted skills and behaviors and needed interventions. I had one child who was primarily in the inclusion classroom for social concerns. He had a really, really hard time communicating with friends, not communicating, he could communicate fine, but he had a hard time making friends, keeping friends, communicating as a whole. And you know, that's not your typical inclusion profile, right? Usually you're still focusing on academics, you're focusing on behavior. Social is kind of tertiary. In this case, that was the primary goal. At the two of the 4 progress reports that I gave, including the IEP meeting, I completely spaced out that like that's what we were there for because the child was doing so well. And so I read through the plot and the mom kind of looked at me and it's like, what about the target skills? What about the reason he's here? Where are my data on that? And I was just like, oh shoot, I have it. I just haven't, you know, written it all up and put it in. So I had to send her an addendum at that point. But you really need to make sure that you're focusing on the skills that are most relevant to that child in the meeting. All right. Allow for parents to ask questions, clarify any information, add about, interject regarding what they're seeing at home. Don't just sit there and read through the document. Really make it more of a conversation. You got to read the whole thing, but make sure the parents are actually taking in everything that you are saying in the plot. It's a lot of information. This is a good opportunity to jog a parent's memory, to jog your own memory about little anecdotes and how it relates to what's going on at home. Okay, so the next 2 slides are examples of plots. The first is of sections of a plot. The first is a child who is on grade level in an inclusion classroom, second grade student, doing really well. The next is a child who is in a self-contained classroom, I believe a first grader who is struggling a little bit more and needs a little bit more intervention. You guys have access to these 2 slides? Okay, I'm going to allow you to take a few minutes. I'm gonna get some water, my voice is getting a little sore. To take a few minutes, read through this slide and the next slide, and then we'll come back and discuss, okay? So like for those of you who are online, about 5 minutes. And I'm gonna pause the recording. Okay, so what are some things that you notice about these 2 sections? It's something, you know. Okay. Yeah, the second one is quite a bit more detailed than the first one, right? And the first child, these are actual flips or excerpts from actual IEPs. In the first one, the child is on grade level curriculum, right? You're going over lots of skills. They're moving at a very, very quick rate. The parent is seeing homework that they regularly understand. They're seeing schoolwork go home. There's a lot of information outside that helps them understand what's happening. In the second one, we're using a curriculum that is very specific, this Morningside phonics program that's very specific to one particular skill that a parent may not be so familiar with. we're working on skills that are not typical of a first grader. Most first graders don't need to work on such specific reading fluency. And so you need a lot more detail to help the parent understand what that program is, how their child's doing, what the goal is for that child, and how much longer are we going to be doing this, even if it's ongoing. Good. What else? Anyone online? Any thoughts that you see? Things that you see? So easy to hide online. Should start calling on people. All right, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to, especially in the second one, is the use of quantitative data, right? When you're, whether it's speaking about a fluency level or a mastery level, you don't want to say the child is doing well. You want the parent to be able to understand, what does well mean? What does good mean? We're going to be looking on Thursday at scripted annual goals and what those actually look like and entail. And what you'll see is that in special education, we have what are called scripted objectives. And those objectives those objectives end up being the annual goals. But those objectives involve a very specific type of mastery criteria, right? We want, whereas a typical child, needs to demonstrate some level of reading fluency, some level of word mastery, some level of vocab mastery. Those are very qualitative words. Those are not very objective words. In special education, you're going to see 18 out of 20 words correct, 60 words per minute, 100% accuracy 3 times out of 5. Something like, you're going to see things that you could actually quantify and put on paper, all right? Those end up getting reported in your class. It's not just, he's doing great, right? This is what great means, okay? The second thing is, I want you to notice the specific behaviors that are mentioned in both of them. Here we talk about student continues to demonstrate his understanding of main idea, author's purpose, cause-effect relationships, that type of thing. Obviously, in this one, there are some very specific behaviors where it's talking about VC, CV word chunks, the levels of books that they're working on. I think it's talking about comprehension at some point, and the types of prompting that are needed to get to those comprehension levels. So we're talking about very specifically defined behaviors. If you think about a general education curriculum and all of the behaviors that are targeted in a year, all right, it'd be very challenging to define each of those so specifically. In special education, even if we are on the inclusion side of things, we are still asked to do that, all right? So having these, and all of this information flows from those annual goals, all right, where we will define those behaviors, we will define that criteria, and that's what's going to get reported on here. The PLEP, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that a parent listens to and understands the PLEP. You as the teacher are pouring your every day into these children, right? This is your opportunity to ensure the parents know what the expectations are, know what's being targeted, know what type of progress has been made, and make some determinations based off of that, all right? The PLEP is the opportunity to function kind of like a brag sheet for students. Look at all the awesome things my child has done or my student has done over the past year, as well as an opportunity to identify like, hey, this is where we are. We're not quite where we want to be. This is how I want to proceed, all right? This is your dialogue. This is your descriptive narrative. All right, after the PLEP, we have the annual goals. The annual goals are, depending on the level of student, will determine how many goals you actually work on. But the annual goals become the kind of objective curriculum for the student. If you look at Louisiana State Standards, second grade math, right? The list of standards there become the goals for a typical second grader in the state of Louisiana. This is that for special education students. So our annual goals are going to be across academic, behavioral, social, communication, speech, OT, PT, and anywhere else, anything else that applies to the student, you're going to have those goals here. If you are in an inclusion classroom with a student who is moving through that curriculum, the inclusion curriculum, you can say goals as defined by Louisiana State Standards and delivered through the curriculum. If you're not, you have to define what those goals are going to be. And as we'll see Thursday, there's going to be a structure to those goals that should make them relatively easy to write. What's really important to remember while developing these goals are that the goals should be based on the developmental age of the child and their past progress, not their chronological age. So this is where you have an opportunity to have a fourth grader who's working on first grade math. And that is their goal, their actual goal. Some districts, and I strongly disagree with this, require that their IEPs include grade level goals, all right? So if you have a seventh grader that is has a severe disability and is significantly behind, they are still going to require a seventh grade level goal. What I say in that situation to the teachers that I've worked with who have to write those goals is write the goal. Like I can't, as a consultant, I can't come in and tell you don't write, blatantly disregard what your district is saying. What I do say is take the goal, take where you are, draw a line from where you are to that goal, and pick the first 4 steps. And those become your objectives. The objectives being your milestones on the way to that goal. In my mind, you should truly limit your goals to where I am now to what can be reasonably achieved in 1 year, period. That's it. If that means that I don't get to grade level, then I don't get to grade level. I definitely want to be working towards that. But if I don't get there, don't force me to get there. Underneath those goals, we have benchmarks or objectives or sub-objectives. These are usually goals or benchmarks that are attainable in 4 to 5 months, or about half the school year. If you want to break it down further, usually attainable within 2 to 3 months. All right. You don't want to have your benchmarks be so broken down that you're meeting a benchmark every week. You don't have to be teaching to that full benchmark, but you want to make sure that, that you have both room to show progress that's meaningful while still giving you the freedom to do what you need to do. So let's say I have a kindergarten special education student My goal, very reasonable goal for a kindergarten sped student might be to learn their letter names by the end of the year. So my objective is, or my annual goal is going to be something along the lines of student will be able to identify the names of all 26 letters with 100% accuracy across 2 sessions by the end of the year. All right, we'll get into the breakdown of all those different components. My benchmark could be one of 2 things. Very simple benchmark would be by January, halfway through, the student will be able to identify 13, right, of those letter names. I could go further. By end of the first 9 weeks, they will be able to identify 6, January 13, third 9 weeks 20, end of the school year 26. That would be reasonable as well. All right. Make sure you check with parents to identify any specific behavioral, social, and emotional goals that you may not, especially earlier on in the IEP years, that may not present themselves at school. All right. There are certain ways that you can address home behaviors at school and school behaviors at home as is necessary. It is not your job as a teacher to solve your child, the students going to bed behavioral problems. If it starts impacting their educational work, which it very well may, then because it's having an educational impact, you may try to identify some ways to help with that. If your goals here, so if your goals are curriculum based, you want to make sure that you have observable and measurable or means of observing and measuring those. All right, that's oftentimes through assessment, your standard assessments that you are going to use. Okay, I'm going to pause there for today. On Thursday, when we pick up, we're going to look specifically at what goes into that structure of an annual goal, and then we'll work through the remainder of the IEP. All right? Sound good? Online guys, I will see you on Thursday. You guys, I'll see you. I already forgot my schedule. Next week? Not next week? We'll see what I say. All right, look out for emails, okay?
Dr. Shanman,
Yes.
is it okay if I talk with you after everybody's gone in private?
Yes. Log back on in like 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. Thank you.